The readings of today draw our mind to many dimensions of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. So I would like to reflect to you this morning on two major aspects of discipleship. The first one is from the first reading, from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Between Isaiah chapters 40 to 55 are passages which are referred to as the passages of the suffering servant, the suffering servant. And this suffering servant was originally believed to have been a member of the community, but the passages are such that they also have references to Jesus Christ. And in the reading we heard, we see the suffering servant talking about his sufferings. But these were sufferings that he willingly embraced. So he tells us, I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard. My face I did not shield from buffet and spitting. Once we cast our minds to Jesus and what he went on by embracing the cross, we see how this is reflected in the life of Jesus. But friends, the aspect of discipleship that I want us to reflect on based on the first reading is how we also as disciples embrace suffering. No one likes suffering. I don't. Maybe you do. But we can't escape suffering as disciples. So how do we embrace suffering? It is either we embrace it with a defeatist mentality, or we embrace suffering with a victorious attitude. But in the first reading, the suffering servant adopted that kind of mentality which helped him to embrace suffering in a more positive way. And how did he do it? He says, I have God for my help. I have God for my help. Therefore, I am not disgraced. So in all the midst of suffering, because he was drawing his strength from God, he knew that what he was going through would never break his spirit. So brothers and sisters, as you go through this week, don't allow any kind of suffering or oppression, whether from your boss or anybody you know in the office or wherever it may come from, don't allow it to break your spirit. Don't allow the sufferings that your wife or your husband brings your way to break your spirit. Only if you can say with the suffering servant, I have God for my help. The suffering servant was so confident because he had God as his help that he could go on and say that, bring the suffering on. He says, if anyone wishes to oppose me, let us appear together. In order to bring it on, I am ready. Who disputes my right? Let that person confront me. See, God is my help. Who will prove me wrong? And he says something again, that because God is my help, I have set my face like flint. knowing that I shall not be put to shame. Flint is a hard rock, a very hard rock. So he says that I am not just like a rock, I am the hardest type of rock, because God is my help, and therefore I shall not be put to shame. So friends, if we are disciples, which of course we are, we need to have a strategy, a methodology of confronting the sufferings and the obstacles which people put in our path. And the way to do it is to have God for your help. But before we can have God for our help, before we can have Christ Jesus for our help, we need to know him. And that takes us to the gospel reading. Jesus and his disciples were on the way. This is Mark chapter 8. So we are about the middle point in Mark's gospel. And one of the fundamental aspects of Mark's gospel is to try to help the Christian people to understand who Jesus is. And where Jesus asked this question is so important, because in Caesarea Philippi, there was a temple to the emperor. So by Jesus asking that question there, it was a way of showing the disciples that, look, the one you are following is more than the emperor. But before they would get to that, he would ask them, who do you people say that I am? Then they give the answers. John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. Then he goes on, but you, who have been following me all this while, who do you also say that I am? The motive of who Jesus was has already been discussed earlier on by the people, the scribes. For instance, if you look at Mark chapter 1, the story of Jesus curing the man with the unclean spirit. After he had cured the man, we are told in verse 27, they were all amazed. And they kept on asking one another, who is this? A new teaching. The same thing in Mark chapter 2. There also, Jesus would forgive sins of somebody who wasn't well, the paralytic. And they would ask, but who can forgive sins but God alone? If you look at the story of the stilling of the lake in Mark chapter 4, they would ask, but who is this that even the winds and the sea obey? So in all those passages, people were trying to figure out the identity of Jesus. But in today's reading, it is Jesus himself who asks them, so who am I? Then Simon Peter will say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Messiah. My dear friends, many of you here have been Christians for so long. So Jesus would want you to reflect on your relationship with him and answer that question for yourself. Who do you say that I am? Or let me put it this way. If your grandchild or your wife or your son would come to you and say, Daddy, who is Jesus? Would you give an answer based on what people say? Or you are going to give an answer based on your own experience of him? How will you answer this question? How how you answer the question is very important, because it is based on how you answer this question that you can confront the sufferings that come your way. That you can say, I have God for my help. I have Jesus for my help because I know him. Not from hearsay, but because I have experienced him myself. So who is Jesus? You see, Peter will say you are the Messiah. But the kind of Messiah Peter had in mind was a different, the political Messiah. So Jesus will want to correct him and say that, look, no, I am the suffering servant. Sometimes we have conceptions of Jesus, and sometimes actually we even put down the job description for Jesus. He must fit a certain conception that we have of who he ought to be. But to understand Jesus would always require us to stand at the foot of the cross. Because he tells us the Son of Man must suffer and die, and in 3 days rise from the dead. So the Messiah is the one who suffers. That was different from the mentality that Peter had. So as you reflect on who is Jesus, also reflect on whether you are understanding Jesus on his own terms, or you want Jesus to fit the kind of Messiah that you intend him to be for you. Remember that you can only embrace the sufferings and say confidently that I have God for my help, and therefore I can never be put to shame, only when you can stand at the foot of the cross and get to know who Jesus is. So as we celebrate today's Mass, just think of my 2 points. 1, if we have God for our help, we will never be put to shame, no matter what. And 2, if you know who Jesus is, you'll be ready to embrace any situation. Because you know that with him as your Lord and Master, he will always be there for you. And that is why Jesus will ask you again, but who do you say that I am?